Let me first thank you all for taking the time to join the special gathering, which is titled Human Rights at Home, Responding to Structural Discrimination and Police Violence. We're really pleased to have the tremendous interest for this event. It's clear to us that it's of great importance for the many of you who've joined from all over the country. We are clearly in extraordinary times of a worldwide pandemic, but there is also widespread calls for racial justice, and really due to the horrific killing of George Floyd and his sacrifice, it is not in vain. With the viewing of it by millions, we have a new generation of activists and the views of so many who previously were resistant, opposed, or simply unattentive to the need for racial justice. There's been a transformation. And it's in this context that we really have this new potential to advance human rights in our cities, counties, states, nation, and world. My name is Robin Toma. I'm Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations and part of the Department of Workforce Development, Aging, and Community Services in Los Angeles County Government. And I'm also honored to serve as the president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. We usually refer to it by its acronym and our unique pronunciation of it, IAOHRA. For those of you who may not know about IAOHRA, we're the only international network of leaders of human rights, civil rights, human relations agencies that are part of our governments in cities, counties, and states across the US and Canada. And we're dedicated to the goal of protecting and fulfilling the human rights of everyone, but especially the most discriminated and vulnerable among us. And we believe it should be the highest priority of our governments. So this gathering today is to provide you information and tools to advancing that goal, whether you're an IAOHRA member or ally. And we'll be looking at how international human rights principles and strategies can help provide ideas and solutions that can address systemic racism and particularly police violence, including through the framework of reparations. I know the potential for change is great. Just looking at our experience in Los Angeles, where our elected officials took bold action to establish an anti-racist policy agenda for our county of 10 million people. And I'm proud to say that in our last elections, all of our elected representatives on the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors are women, for the first time in LA, and perhaps anywhere for just jurisdiction of our size. Let me thank our wonderful co-sponsors and partners, the ACLU, Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, Mothers Against Police Brutality. Without them, this event would not be happening today, and you're going to have the good fortune to hear from them later on. But let's begin by hearing some introductory remarks from a very special guest, Dominique Day. Ms. Day is the chairperson of the United Nations Working Group on People of African Descent. She's also a human rights attorney and the executive director of Daylight, Rule of Law, Access to Justice, Advocacy. Internationally, her litigation, public policy, research, teaching, and capacity building work over the past 2 decades has focused heavily on racial justice, non-discrimination, and human rights advocacy. She has extensive experience in criminal and civil litigation on behalf of individuals and communities within the Black diaspora, in addition to working on rule of law and access to justice issues in post-conflict and transitional states. She holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard and a Juris Doctor from Stanford Law School. So you can understand why we're thrilled to have her with us today. Ms. Day, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for convening this incredibly important conversation. I think we're at a key moment to reflect, to recognize how our systems are serving us or failing to, and to renegotiate some things in the context of what we are learning during this moment of pandemic and massive renegotiation of all of our lives. I think one thing we've seen is that the professionalization of policing, which was often cited as the solution and the process to really eradicate violence, brutality, and structural racism from policing, that this hasn't been a solution for structural discrimination, and it hasn't been particularly effective. for us, I think we work sort of all over the world looking at the situation of people of African descent. In the first few months of COVID alone, many of us were able to observe unwarranted, unnecessary, I don't even know the right word because there's no justifying this, right? But violence against people of African descent on camera in New York City, in cities in the United States. But we also received reports from the UK, Spain, Italy, Colombia, Brazil, South Africa of exactly the same, that Afro-descendant communities, Afro-descendant cities were seeing massive upticks in police interventions, police violence, and destabilization of communities by policing during a pandemic, which from its very beginning was acknowledged and measured to show particular severity against Black people globally. If you saw the hearings this morning in the US Congress around the January 6th insurrection, coup, whatever we're calling it, you'll see that the very professionalization protocols were immediately abandoned. You didn't see an effective chain of command. These systems disregarded the actual threats that were set forth from the beginning. And the systems ignored the realities of what was happening even as it was unfolding. Some people would say these systems were operating as they were always designed, not to effectively protect community safety, but to heavily surveil and control Black and brown bodies. And this is the space where we're kind of forced to make an acknowledgement right now, right? And we're in a pandemic that we've seen extraordinary risk and pain and burden to Black communities. At the same time, that risk has never been incorporated into the way policing has responded. In fact, perhaps the opposite. It feels as though you're seeing the stress, the uncertainty, the fear of pandemic released in terms of violence and brutality against Black communities. So, you can look at international instruments, and this is what we do on policing, their focus on process and training. I would argue that maybe this is the moment for us to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to look at the ICCPR, to look at the well-recognized international right to reparations, instead of the way some of these items have been interpreted, to reflect this balance between safety and liberty that we constantly invoke when we're talking about policing. Because this balance between safety and liberty has always put Black and brown communities at the fulcrum of the seesaw, at the pivot point of the seesaw, where Black and brown communities are facing less safety and less liberty in a dynamic where we act as though to increase community safety measures will somehow protect, to increase liberty measures will somehow afford, and yet Black and brown communities have never benefited from this balance, but instead have seen restrictions from both sides. So to that end, I think this is a moment, as I said, to reflect, to renegotiate, to recognize the role of organizers in exposing what's really happening versus the ways we talk about it, and in shifting the narratives, to recognize our own role in talking about how these issues show up locally, but reflect global realities on race, money, and power. Understanding how instruments could be used, not merely to demonstrate intent, but also to actualize these commitments. To understand how community safety may rely on solutions that do not constantly invoke, build, or fund policing. And to ask ourselves, how can we work inside, outside, around, and through these systems to demand better, and to focus our urgency on the protection of the communities that have been seen as disposable, expendable, and available as sacrificial lambs. So I welcome this conversation today. I do believe it is the important conversation we need to be having, and I'm very pleased to have been able to join you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring to hear about what's happening at international level, and we look forward to a report that I know that your United Nations Working Group is working on, that we hope can be a tool and of assistance to all the our member agencies. I know that in Los Angeles County, our Commission on Human Relations has worked for years on looking at the issue of policing and human relations. And we are currently in a phase of implementing key reforms. And so to bring to bear not only state and national law, but also international human rights principles, I think just gives additional force to that work. So thank you, Ms. Day, for your remarks. Let me turn now to our next speaker. Jamil Dakwar is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program. And that program is dedicated to holding the US government accountable to its international human rights obligations and commitments. Jamil leads a team of lawyers and advocates who use a human rights framework to complement existing ACLU legal and legislative advocacy, primarily in the arenas of counterterrorism, racial justice, immigrants' rights, women's rights, and criminal and juvenile justice. And this program also conducts human rights research, documentation, and public education, as well as engages in litigation and advocacy before US courts and international human rights bodies. So with that, for those of you who may recognize him because he is a friend of IAOHRA and someone who I'm pleased to call a friend, let me give you Jamil Dakwar.
Thank you very much, Robin, for this introduction. And I am really excited and very honored to be part of this conversation. I want to thank IAOHRA, friends and colleagues. We've had many opportunities to work together. I think your agency, your agencies, your commissions, your association has really been critical in bringing human rights to the very state and local levels. And we continue to look forward for more collaboration in the future. I want to also thank other co-sponsors of the event, particularly Mothers Against Police Brutality, for their incredible work over the past several years, and particularly over the past year in highlighting the important voice of families, and particularly mothers of victims of police violence. We're really honored to support and work with you. And to Human Rights Institute at Columbia University, a long-time collaborator and a good troublemaker with us in the area of human rights. So really happy to be part of that. I want to thank Dominique Day as the independent expert of the United Nations and the chair of the working group on Africa and people of African descent. The working group has been really incredibly critical in centering the voices and the experiences of people of African descent around the world, and particularly in the United States. And we're really looking forward to continue to work with the chair and with other members of the working group, particularly as they contribute to the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which we will be talking about. I want to also thank, just finally, my colleague, Nick Armayo, who had helped with the logistics of this meeting and with other support. So I will be talking for about, hopefully 15, not more than 20 minutes. And I was asked to provide an overview of the human rights framework. This is almost an impossible mission to do because there's so much to cover in a very short time. I mean, it could be a day or more than one day to cover all the relevant international human rights treaties and laws and decisions and judgments and jurisprudence and advisory opinions and general recommendations and what have you. But we're going to try to give you a snapshot. I'm going to try to cover very briefly what the applicable human rights framework, particularly in the context of the right to reparations, the right to remedy, because I think that it's very obvious that human rights law really stands against police brutality, against extrajudicial killing, and we can obviously provide that information as well, resources. But I thought that in order to move to the point of how do you really connect the conversation about systemic racism and police violence to the conversation about reparations or right to remedy, right to effective remedy, which is really enshrined in international human rights law. And it's something that where the United States, we have not always lived up to the promise or to the obligations to protect that right, especially now that there's all conversations about shifting paradigms and leading to transformational change, structural changes, rather than cosmetic changes. So I hope over a very brief overview, you will be able to get a sense of what the human rights framework says about the right to repair in the context of a human rights violation. I will start first with giving you just a quick update where we are globally in fostering accountability for police violence, and particularly racist police violence. As you know, and as Robin mentioned, the horrific killing of George Floyd on May 25th last year was basically outraged the whole world, not just the United States. There were protests nationwide. There were protests all over the world, demanding basic human rights for people like George Floyd, for Black people who have for a long time have been denied justice and been denied basic protection and basic equal protection before the law, particularly when it comes to encountering law enforcement. And as the Black Lives Matter protests were expanding and people taking the streets to express their outrage, there was also a lot of interest among international human rights bodies to reiterate, in fact, things that they already said about the United States. It wasn't a new thing. A number of international human rights bodies, like the special rapporteurs, for example, the UN Working Group on People of African Descent, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, Special Rapporteur on Torture, Special Rapporteur on Minority Affairs, Human Rights Council in general expressed concern about the rise in racial discrimination, particularly of people of African descent. And then you have the specific bodies that are entrusted to monitor compliance with international human rights treaties, some of which the United States ratified, have also repeatedly monitored, documented, and condemned and asked for action, asked for recommendations to be implemented in order to change the situation. And yet, unfortunately, years over the last 15 or 20 years that at least I have been working in this space in the United States, there's very little that has been done to dramatically shift to a concrete action that is based on human rights compliance, that is based on centering impacted communities and their basic human rights. And as we were watching what was happening, we felt that there was a need for the highest level of accountability that exists internationally and globally to finally hold the United States accountable for years and decades, in fact, centuries of violating Black bodies, violating basic human rights of people of African descent in the United States, and which has always been a call historically by Black organizations like the NAACP or the Civil Rights Congress or We Charge Genocide, an organization that also went to the UN, or Malcolm X, the Black leader who called for accountability at the international level at the African Union Summit, where he clearly saw that this is not a domestic issue. This is not an issue of civil rights only. It's a matter of human rights. And from that context, we gathered, this is the ACLU working with Professor Gay McDougall, with the US Human Rights Network. We drafted a letter that we then consulted and worked with families of victims of police violence and asked other civil society organizations to join us to call for an independent commission of inquiry to be established by the United Nations Human Rights Council in order to look at the systemic racism and police violence in the United States. That letter, in a matter of days, had over 600 signatures from civil society groups from all over the world, and essentially set a new precedent in terms of mobilizing world community, civil society community to demand racial justice in the United States. This letter immediately was echoed by African group within the United Nations that essentially comprises of the 54 countries, African countries, to demand an urgent session of the Human Rights Council and to look into the possibility of establishing a commission of inquiry. In fact, they issued or presented a draft resolution that called for the first time ever to establish a commission of inquiry to look into systemic police violence in the United States, particularly against Africans and people of African descent. The meeting was held on June 17, where all countries around the world had addressed the issues of racial justice and racial injustice, and particularly in the context of police violence. This was the first time that the council would hold such a meeting. So in that way, it was really a historic meeting. But at the same time, it was, while it was historic, it was moving in the right direction. It was disappointing because most of the countries avoided naming the United States as a violator of human rights, avoided calling United States for its decades-long violations of fundamental rights, particularly against people of African descent, and played the safe diplomatic game of even with the Trump administration in power last summer, we would not go as far as naming and shaming and condemning the United States, even though the individuals, the peoples, and their governments strongly believe in it. That in fact, peoples in their own countries were protesting and demanding Black Lives Matter. As a result of U.S. intimidation and pressure and, in fact, bullying that happened behind closed doors or behind Zoom calls, if you wish, the resolution was watered down. And instead of independent commission of inquiry, we ended up with a report that would be put together by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and would be presented to the Human Rights Council in June of this year. I want you to watch the short video of George Floyd's brother when he addressed the Human Rights Council and when he told the world on June 17 in a recorded video that was for the first time showing a family member of victim of police violence addressing the council in that manner in the beginning of the session, rather at the end or as a result, as a part of a time of civil society. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Bear with me and have it on. Sorry.
I think you need to play the slide and then it'll give you.
Yeah, I am going to do that, right.
So if you go to slideshow.
There you go.
On May 25th, 2020, my brother was tortured and murdered by 4 police officers. When a crowd of witnesses, my brother was tortured and murdered by 4 police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. My brother begged the officer for his life, cried out for our mama, who was already dead, and said over and over again, "I can't breathe." The officer showed no mercy, no humanity, and tortured my brother to death in the middle of the street in Minneapolis, with a crowd of witnesses watching and begging them to stop showing us Black people the same lesson yet again: Black lives do not matter in the United States of America. None of the police officers were fired for murdering my brother until masses of people in the United States and around the world protested the injustice. When people dared to raise their voice and protest for my brother, they were tear gassed, run over with police vehicles. Several people lost eyes and suffered brain damage to rubber bullets. Peaceful protesters were shot and killed by police. Journalists were beaten and blinded when they tried to show the world the brutality happening in the protests. When people raise their voices to protest the treatment of Black people in America, they are silenced, they are shot and killed. My brother George Floyd is one of the many Black men and women that have been murdered by police in recent years. The sad truth is that the case is not unique. The way you saw my brother tortured and murdered on camera is the way Black people are treated by police in America. You watched my brother die. That could have been me. I am my brother's keeper. You in the United Nations are your brothers and sisters keepers in America. And you have the power to help us get justice for my brother George Floyd. I'm asking you to help him. I'm asking you to help me. I'm asking you to help us, Black people in America. I hope that you would consider establishing an independent commission of inquiry to investigate police killings of Black people in America and the violence used against peaceful protesters.
So this was the moving, very powerful call for accountability from George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd, and he made that call on that day that the council held the special session. At the end of that session, the Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 43-1, and this is the summary of it, the operative summary, basically calling for a report that will be put together by the Office of the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on systemic racism, violations of international human rights law against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies, especially those incidents that resulted in the death of George Floyd and other Africans and people of African descent, to contribute to accountability and redress for victims. The resolution also requested to examine government responses to anti-racism peaceful protests, including the alleged use of excessive force by law enforcement, including against bystanders, journalists, and others. So this was the resolution that is now subject to a lot of consultation, meetings, gathering of information and documentation by the United Nations Human Rights Office. They just had a consultation last Thursday for US civil society organizations. There will be a session on March 18 at the Human Rights Council to provide an update on how the progress is made to advance this particular report. And the report itself will be finalized and presented to the council in June. So this is going to be one of opportunities for us once we see the report. How do we really transform this report? While it's not on the United States per se, the United States will be mentioned, some cases will be highlighted in the report, but it is a global report, and yet it's going to be very significant in the sense that it will be the first report of its kind. It will have findings and recommendations that will be helpful to advance the questions that have been raised, the intersection of systemic racism and police violence. Let me just briefly give you the overview of the human rights framework with regard to particularly the right to effective remedy, the right to remedy and reparations. We would start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948. Obviously, that is a declaration. It's not a legally binding treaty, but it's really has presented and later on was codified in subsequent human rights treaties that were legally binding. But Article 2, for example, speaks specifically at the principle of non-discrimination in providing effective remedy, right? Article 6 of the declaration talks about the right to recognition as a person before the law. And Article 7 also talks about the right to equal protection. And in particular, what's relevant really to the right to effective remedy, we have specific language that talks about everyone has the right in Article 8 to effective remedy by the competent national tribunals for acts violating the fundamental rights granted by him or her by the Constitution or by the law. This is a very foundational right that has been already recognized in 1948, right? And yet later on, the principle of equality and non-discrimination and the right to effective remedy have been reinforced and expanded in several subsequent human rights treaties, namely the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1966, came into force in the 1970s, and the United States ratified the treaty in 1992. And in that treaty, Article 2.3 specifically addresses the right to an effective remedy, that states are obligated to ensure victims of human rights violations have an effective remedy, that victims have the right to have their claims determined, again, by competent judicial, administrative, or legislative authorities, or any other competent authority, and that the competent authorities enforces such remedies, right? That's obviously something only sometimes lacking. In the Article 14.1 of the ICCPR also talks about equality before the law. And that is here about the discrimination, the way that laws are usually implemented. And we've seen a lot of those examples in the United States. And Article 14.1 says all persons shall be equal before the courts and tribunals in determination of any criminal charge against him or her, or of his rights or obligations in a suit at a law. Everyone shall be entitled to a fair and public hearing by a competent, independent, and impartial tribunal established by law. And then there are other international human rights treaties that specifically address the right to redress or right to remedy. For example, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel or Inhumane Degrading Treatment or Punishment. This is the full title of the treaty that the United States has also ratified in 1994. Specifically in Article 14.1 talks about the right to redress and to an enforceable right to fair and adequate compensation, including the means for as full rehabilitation as possible. This is really a critical article because many acts of violence, police violence, amount to torture. And as a result, I think there's a really important to think about acts of violence as police violence as also a violation, not only the right to life or the right to the right of persons to have non-discrimination or to be to have their not to be violated, but also as a result of torture. The act of police abuse could amount to torture if it meets the definition of torture under the Convention Against Torture. There's also other treaties that the United States has not ratified. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, a number of victims of police violence are children. And as a result, there's important to use the instrument, even though the United States has not ratified it. It has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and there should be looked at least for guidance and how this also raises and promotes the obligation to promote physical, psychological recovery and social reintegration of a child victim of any form of neglect, exploitation, or abuse, or torture, or any other form of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, or in armed conflicts. And more importantly, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which the United States ratified in 1994, specifically talks about, obviously, not only to eliminate systemic racism, to eliminate racial discrimination, and there has to be, there are positive measures that need to be taken in order to address past discrimination. There's specific language around the issues of what is it need to be done by states, and here on the right to remedy, again, states are obligated or obliged to ensure effective protection and remedies through the competent national tribunals and other state institutions, as well as the right to seek from such tribunal just and adequate reparation or satisfaction for any damage suffered as a result of racial discrimination. Again, this is a very important source that talks about the right to repair for human rights violation, particularly for racial discrimination. CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And again, unfortunately, this is another treaty that the United States has not yet ratified. We have signed the treaty, but have not ratified it yet. And it specifically had specific language related to the obligation to provide remedy by national tribunals. And oftentimes, victims of police violence are also women unfortunately not always as known as other victims of police violence, particularly transgender women. From here, the more recent treaty that was adopted by the international community, by the United Nations, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So many victims of police violence, whether those who were killed or those who were seriously injured, are people with disabilities, with all kinds of disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and etc. And therefore, here again, state parties shall ensure effective access to justice for persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others, including through the provision of procedural and age-appropriate accommodations in order to facilitate their effective role as direct and indirect participant, including as witnesses in all legal proceedings, including at investigative and other preliminary stages. And look even further, it speaks specifically about the need to make sure that there's effective access to justice for people with disabilities through promotion of appropriate training for those working in the field of administration of justice, including police and prison staff. Now, those were, in a nutshell, international human rights treaties. There are also a number of what we call soft law instruments. These are not treaties, but rather declarations adopted by the United Nations, by other regionals, oftentimes regional human rights bodies. For example, in this case, the UN Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power of 1985, specifically focuses on victims of domestic crimes committed by individuals and affirms the right to access to justice, etc. There's an important body of principles called the Basic Principles and Guideline on the Right to Remedy and Reparations for Victims of Gross Violations of International Human Rights Law that was adopted in 2005. And here it affirms that the victim's rights to equal and effective access to justice, adequate, effective, and prompt reparation for harm suffered, and access to relevant information concerning violations and reparations mechanisms. And I think more importantly, I want to highlight these particular basic principles and guidelines on the question of reparations that specifically require that should be a restitution. That is the restoration of liberty, enjoyment of human rights, identity, family life, citizenship, return to one's place of residence. That's in general. In the context of policing, that is really sometimes trying to look at making people whole, and you can't bring someone who was killed, but at least to the extent that you can provide any support to the family, compensation for economically accessible damage, rehabilitation. That's oftentimes something that families, and you will hear my friend and my colleague Colette Faranagan talking about the lack of support to families of victims of police violence. And here, rehabilitation should be offered, medical, psychological, legal, and social services to those who are victims of human rights violation. And the last two are really also important and not very much known, satisfaction. That is, there has to be a cessation of violations, and there should be judicial and administrative sanctions against perpetrators. So it has to be some sort of a way to end this kind of violations, and there has to be some accountability before administrative and judicial bodies. And finally, guarantees of non-repetition. There have to be also ways that there would be some reform, some legislative action, some measures taken in order to make sure that these violations don't happen again. And again, when we talk about police reform and ending systemic police violence, oftentimes there's about what can we do in order to end or prevent the next violent police act. I just want to, my time is run, I think ran out of time, but I just want to mention specifically the really impediments to what we have seen in the United States. The fact that we have impunity has been unfortunately, there is a culture of impunity for police violence. And the three reasons for that are the lack of independent investigations mechanisms to hold law enforcement officers accountable, the existence of multiple legal and practical obstacles to criminal, civil, and administrative accountability mechanisms for law enforcement agents who commit extrajudicial killings, including, for example, qualified immunity, including the lack of ability to be able to receive compensation. and obviously systemic and structural racism more generally, which is something that is really important to keep in mind, that policing institutions are part and parcel of a broader system of racism, is not only isolated from historic structural racism. In the past several years, particularly with the rise of the most important movement, I think, in modern US history, the Black Lives Matter movement, have demanded calls for ending impunity for state violence against Black people, but also sometimes against white vigilante groups, right? Cases like Trayvon Martin, who was not killed necessarily by police force. Second, ensuring reparations for current and past human rights violations committed against Black communities, and reallocating public funds from the police to reinvest in Black communities and other communities of color. The so-called, the call for divesting from the police, or the call for defunding the police, is reallocating resources to social services, those services that have been critical and lacking in providing support for communities for over years, particularly because there was a structural and systemic racism in the allocation of those resources. And yet the police departments have become the main tool in order to control, in order to respond to emergencies, in order to respond oftentimes to mental health crises, etc. And finally, I just wanted to put all of this in context of the call for reparations more historically. It is really hard to disconnect the conversation about ending police violence and systemic racism in the United States from the centuries-old history of slavery, or the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, that essentially perpetuated in a second-class citizenship for people of African descent in the United States, and deprived them of basic human rights. And right now, there is a push on the federal level to pass HR 40, which is a law that would, if this bill would be made law, it would establish a federal commission to examine the institution of slavery and its impact, as well as make recommendations for reparations to Congress. So it's not necessarily going to make reparations, but it will do the study, and it will cover also the history of slavery, the role of federal and state governments that played in supporting slavery and racial discrimination against descendants of enslaved Africans, and they can make those recommendations. There are, I believe, more than 170 co-sponsors in Congress right now. I think there are more. There's a active, wide coalition of organizations working on that. There's many Black organizations that have spearheaded this. And we, as ACLU, we've been supporting them, particularly COBRA, that have been one of the main leading organizations demanding reparations for people of African descent in the United States. So I hope that people, when they think about reparations, by the way, it's not only compensation. It's not about monetary compensation. It's really more about thinking about these institutional changes that need to be made. The transformational changes need to be made in government, in the way that people are able to fully enjoy their human rights. And that sort of, it starts with acknowledgement. It starts with looking at history, acknowledging that history, and looking in a way that that would restore and repair the damage to those communities. And I think police violence is part of that problem, particularly because of the history of some police departments and institutions that started as slave patrol units around the country. I'm sorry for taking more time, but I thank you and I'll be happy to be part of the Q&A afterwards.
Jamil, do you want to briefly just also introduce Colette?
I am more than honored to have with us Colette Faranagan. Colette is a leading advocate. She's an expert that I learn from her every time we speak, every time we do work together. Colette is someone who had been organizing mothers who had, like her, been impacted by police violence, and particularly by her taking away her son. that in of itself, Clinton Allen, in the way that he was killed by Dallas Police Department, had made her become someone who is going to try her best, turning her life into an advocate to prevent the next police violence, but also put it in the context of the history of racism in this country. And so I'm really glad that she's with us. She has founded Mothers Against Police Brutality shortly after her son died or killed by the police. And she is organizing more than 400 families of victims of police violence, seeking accountability, seeking to organize themselves, seeking to support themselves, seeking to make sure that their voices and their experiences are being recognized and being taken into account when people are going to try to solve this problem. So Colette, you have the floor.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Jamil. It's a privilege to be here today with my esteemed colleagues. I'm thankful for their work and contributions every day, especially to my friend Jamil and the ACLU for their unwavering work, human rights work in many verticals. As Jamil mentioned, I'm Colette Faranagan, founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality. Our organization is dedicated to ending police violence against the public, particularly Black people who bear the greatest burden of this official oppression. I started MAPB in 2013 when the Dallas police killed my only son, Clinton Allen. Clinton was only 25 years old. He was unarmed, just a new father of twin boys. Clinton was shot 7 times, 5 times in his chest, 2 times in his upper left arm, and the last final shot was to his back at close range. As egregious as Clinton's death sounds, it is echoed over and over in Black communities in the United States almost every single day. And make no mistake about it, when there is an agency that wields the type of unchecked power coupled with impunity like the US police departments, it becomes a serious threat to our democracy, and it sets global dangerous examples. Although police brutality is not unique, it's not a unique American problem. Racist police violence in the United States has no equivalent in Western democracies. MAPB works from a unique perspective, from a perspective that gives us the lived experience through the lens of mothers and family members who have lost children and loved ones to police violence in the United States. And when you work from the lived experience aspect of losing a child to police violence, you have the unique opportunity to understand the total impact and devastation, that total impact that is not often seen by anyone but the immediate families that's left to bear this unfathomable burden of death and mayhem and isolation that occurs after every police shooting. MAPB now has a base of over 400 impacted families that are part of our network. And what we've learned from working with impacted families is that these extrajudicial killings have a rippling effect that tears through not only the families, but it tears through these communities that are, in most cases, already struggling economically, socially, and quite often mentally because of lack of resources that have never been allocated and funds to address these issues in these communities. And then you add police violence to these unfunded communities that are already hurting and suffering. How does a community rebuild from that? Brothers and cousins and sons and fathers, uncles watch helplessly as many people, as people that look like them are killed right in front of them in their own communities. And then they're told by their local district attorneys that there will not be any justice coming because in most cases, The district attorneys have allowed the police departments to investigate themselves, and they found no fault. And although that victim that came from that community, in most cases, is unarmed or mentally incapacitated, but all the officer has to say is that he feared for his life. And these miscarriages of justice, when this happens, it breaks the social contract. And when the social contract is broken, the trust is gone. And when the trust is gone, there is no such thing as community policing. You know, I see a lot of programs about community policing, but there's never been a drill down into the community as, you know, why the community policing in almost every instance fail, because the trust is not there, because the social contract has been broken, because the repair work has never taken place. When I think about the insurrection on January the 6th, I shudder to think what might have happened if that crowd had been Black people gathering in those numbers at the Capitol. I'm reminded of Miriam Carey, who was killed by those same policemen in 2013, when she was not having her best moment. She was having a mental episode and she was confused, and she was driving with her 13-month-old child strapped in, and she ended up in front of the White House gates. And when she attempted to make a U-turn after being ordered to stop, she proceeded to leave, and they shot into her car and they killed her with her 13-month-old baby in the car. This is one person. And we had thousands and thousands of people that surged upon the Capitol that were, you know, attacking police officers. And this one Black woman had a bad moment, and she was killed by those same policemen. I want to emphasize that police brutality is a national crisis that needs a global movement, not only a national strategy, but a global strategy, a national legislative and policy changes to end it. Because law enforcement abuse of human rights plays at the local level, at the hands of local officials, we sometimes can't see the breadth of the crisis, because it's locally, and it's over and over, time and time again. Local and state commissioners could work closely with organizations like Mothers Against Police Brutality to learn about our work and how they can bring their expertise and their resources to work together, and in some cases champion causes against police brutality in areas where they may have a much farther reach than organizations. Police brutality is a national disgrace. It's a shameful stain upon this country. Police brutality was birthed from slave catchers over 150 years ago. And this global issue will continue to be an issue, and it will require global accountability for police killings. The United States should not be above the international law that protects the right of life and freedom from racial discrimination. It is imperative that the United Nations holds the United States accountable for turning a blind eye to atrocities to police brutality. MAPB has submitted some recommendations to United Nations, and I'll just read a few of them. We believe that the United Nations should pressure the Department of Justice to lower their bar of engagement. The civil rights criteria for the U.S. Department of Justice involvement in officer-involved shootings, they are too limited. And the standard for involvement has not generally been used as a basis for prosecution in fatal encounters with police. The U.S. Department of Justice should establish a civil rights unit in each U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate and, when warranted, prosecute officers involved in fatal police shootings. The taking of a life by law enforcement, unless in self-defense, is an act of deadly official oppression, a violation of basic human rights. The victim in an officer-involved shooting, it must be remembered, has not been convicted of any crime. So we can't allow policemen to be judged, jury, and executioners. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights should establish an initiative in human rights and law enforcement to monitor and conduct research and to receive reports from impacted communities on injustice in law and local law enforcement. Beyond the fatal shootings of thousands of persons annually by law enforcement in the United States, it is the police officers in cities from Laos to Hong Kong who are the enforcers of repression. The United Nations has programs concerning issues from adequate housing to water sanitation, and there is, in fact, a human rights dimension to all of those issues of about adequate housing and water sanitation. We understand that, but surely there is a place for human rights and law enforcement and the inventory of the High Commissioner's concerns. This initiative would provide hope of redress for citizens throughout the world who suffer from police brutality, corruption, and repression. In addition, MAPB believes that every district attorney office in every state in the United States should have a public integrity unit dedicated to investigating police shootings, which would stop police departments from investigating themselves. We know that having a public integrity office that investigates police killings makes a vast difference in how policemen are held accountable and how they are investigated. We learned while investigating my son's case that the Dallas County District Attorney did not perform its own investigations of officer-involved shootings. Instead, the DA would sit back, let the police department investigate themselves, and merely rubber stamp the investigation. And in Clinton's case, the district attorney ignored sworn affidavits, notarized statements that myself and my family had collected from witnesses on the scene. They were not interested in any witnesses that went against the police department because they were depending on the police department to investigate themselves. In fact, in every single police shooting, fatal police shooting in Dallas at that time, and since 1973, had been found to be justified at the time that Clinton was killed. Despite hundreds of official killings, there were no charges, no indictments, no punishments. After 40 years of no police accountability in Dallas, after the Public Integrity Unit was started, we began to see the Public Integrity Unit make a difference. And some policemen began to be prosecuted and convicted. So we know that it makes a difference. These beginning steps toward police accountability just in Dallas are largely the result of our campaign, MAPB's campaign in 2013 and 2014 to establish a civil rights unit within the DA's office to investigate police shootings. And that's why we are advocating to have these public integrity units started and implemented in every state in the United States. We also need to provide compensation for victims of police brutality, for families who lose their children and loved ones to official homicide. Compensation is often denied under the various state laws and programs concerning victims of crime. In short, if there are any victim compensation programs in many states, you are not considered a victim if you were killed by a policeman. If a policeman kills you, you are automatically denied any type of victim's compensation. Large legal settlements for wrongful death are occasionally reported in the media, but most families are left with nothing but their grief. Let me close by saying that police abuse of citizens is a worldwide phenomenon. As we've seen in recent protests in Nigeria, we understand the necessity for global solidarity. For our struggle to be successful, we need international pressure on the United States to end unaccountable police violence, and we need our local and state commissioners to engage with us. Bring your expertise, for them to bring their resources and their years of knowledge in advocating for human rights to this fight against police brutality. I'll end today with a video of a few moms, a few family members that have lost their precious loved ones to police violence, children, loved ones that are gone forever. And thank you for having me today.
Just think about your child. Just think about your brother. Just put yourself in another human being's shoes.
You hear people say that sometimes you just need to get over it, or friends say you need to get over and move on, but you know, that's easy to say when it's not you.
It is truly like, wow, us, you know, you never really think about it happening to you and you feel for the other people, but it happened and my heart broke. I have a broken heart.
If I tell you the whole story, I wouldn't be able to talk because it's that
not only have my life changed, but the lives of my family, close friends, and even some people that I didn't even know.
What started out as a celebration of birth, my cousin's 45th birthday party, ended in tragedy. It ended in an off-duty Arlington police officer shooting and killing my brother, Wame, my only sibling.
And my heart drops because no one calls me that early in the morning. And my other sister says they killed him. And I say, killed who? And they say, Marquise.
It just keeps going over and over in my mind. How can you shoot an individual while they're sitting in their car and justify it? You can't.
My name is Quinta Sanders. My son's name is Torrey Sanders. He was murdered May 5th, 2017 in Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County in a sheriff's department. He was murdered by the sheriffs, jailers, and also police officers of Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County. A mother never wants to bury her child. Yes, I had to bury my son. Next month would have been his 32nd birthday. He didn't get to make it there. We paid an awful big price. Not only myself, not only his siblings, he has 2 brothers, but also his children.
We miss you, Daddy! And yet my family still is left broken. Instead of them, like my son was murdered for nothing. He had no reason to stop him. My son wasn't committing a crime. But they immediately started attacking my son's character, and he was the victim. They uplifted this police officer. When he killed my son, they promoted him to SWAT. He got paid leave. So you kill my son, you get a promotion, and you get paid for it. And our family is broken.
So we need to come together and fight the system. Until we break the system, this is going to continue to happen because the police officers have become the judge, the jury, and the executioners of our family members, and they have given them that right.
Thank you, Colette, for your remarks and your work, and to the families that you work with. I think it's really difficult and also important to listen to the stories and the voices of mothers, and to be responsive to their work. Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Camaford. Despite the challenges in the conversation, I'm really thrilled to be with all of you today. And I want to express my gratitude to Colette for her work and strength in this advocacy, and for taking these stories in Dallas to the DOJ and to the UN. I want to thank the IAOHRA board, especially Robin and Jean and Elisa and Jim and Ken for making the space for this conversation today, and to Jamil for pushing accountability forward, but also this conversation. I'm really thrilled to be with all of you. I wish it was in person. I have long worked with IAOHRA to think about how we can both engage at the international level to ensure that state and local commissions have the resources they need to do their human rights work, but also to push for accountability for the areas where the US is not in compliance with human rights principles. So my role here today, and we are running short on time, but is really to plant a few seeds for our collective thinking about how we move between these principles that Dominique and Jamil laid out and the very local manifestations of police violence and structural discrimination in our communities, and to think about how we all can work together, and particularly what state and local agencies have been doing and can also be doing moving forward. And I wanted to just start with the recognition that state and local governments are already doing this work in many, many places, building the bridges across communities and between communities and law enforcement and other decision makers to strengthen racial and gender equity. So I am really here reporting back what I am always encouraged to be able to find, which is the amazing innovations at the state and local level. So I'm going to mention a few concrete examples from across the country that really align with the principles that we learned about from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the idea of the right to a remedy and redress, and that support both repair and reparations. And as we mentioned at the start, I'm not sure if everyone was here, but we'll be sharing out resources and links to these local examples in particular. And I am going to just kind of share, I'm going to share my slides now, hopefully. I'm on my child's computer, so that's how my day is going today, but hopefully it'll work. Okay, can we see that? Awesome. So I've categorized these initiatives into kind of different actions or strategies that state and local commissions and really state and local governments more broadly can take. And I'm going to focus on 5 of them: raising awareness, documenting and reporting on discrimination and disparities, addressing structural discrimination in policy change initiatives at the local level in relation to law enforcement, as well as some more jurisdiction-wide examples of addressing historic harms and fostering racial equity moving forward. And the last strategy that I will talk about is advocating for national level reforms, some of which Jamil mentioned. So the first examples are raising awareness. And I started with something from my hometown, New York, which is a public awareness raising campaign. As you'll see on this slide, there are posters that were developed by the New York City Human Rights Commission to respond to increases in anti-Asian bias that emerged when COVID became a huge problem in New York City, and which are also meant to celebrate the diversity of our city in these really challenging times. And the second slide, Palo Alto Speaks, is an initiative from the Palo Alto Human Rights Commission, which was really a social media campaign tethered with community surveys and community forums to collect and reflect the experiences of Black and Brown community members in order to shape the city's race and equity agenda. The second strategy I wanted to just mention is documenting and reporting on the lived experience of African Americans and other marginalized community members, because I think when we're talking about discrimination, we have to remember how it plays out for multiple communities, though much of our conversation today is about anti-Black racism specifically. And so I wanted to just note examples from New York. Again, we have a report that the New York City Commission released actually during COVID in 2020, which reflects the experience of Black New Yorkers with anti-Black racism, and is based on community surveys, focus groups, and data collection. And we've seen other commissions in the times of lockdown and limited community engagement, really using Zoom and other social media platforms to engage in community meetings and hearings to collect information really since June 2020 about what is the community climate around racism and discrimination. And while documentation and awareness raising are critical, I think they're foundational to the changes that we're talking about if we want transformation. But we also need to be thinking about addressing specific policy changes. And Colette mentioned some of these already, but we've been looking at the different ways that commissions in particular have been supporting different policy changes at the local level. And so I will be the first to acknowledge that some of the examples and ideas here are incremental change. I think they do really, as Colette was saying, lay a foundation for the critical shifts we need to take to be dismantling structural discrimination while also addressing the way it plays out sometimes in very individual and personal circumstances. So really starting with repair is the idea that Colette mentioned around compensation and services for families. So, right, it's not just about monetary compensation, it's also about ensuring that families who we just heard talk about being broken have the support they need to move forward. There's also, as Jamil referred to, growing advocacy for funding to be allocated to alternatives to criminalization. So some places it's divest, some places it's defund, some places it's change funding, however you call it. There are really clear examples of cities committing to reallocating resources. San Francisco has agreed to redirect funds from policing to meet community needs, and the Human Rights Commission really fostered community engagement on how money should be redirected, in particular to Black communities. Seattle's commission has been also urging redirected funding. And in Austin, Texas, for those of you who have been reading about some of the innovations and also the pushback on those innovations, the city council is diverting funding from law enforcement to create more beds for homeless people. Commissions can also, in the arena of law enforcement, promote collection and reporting of disaggregated data, something that is really required by the human rights framework, in fact, and treaties the US has ratified. And in Alexandria, Virginia, and Jean is on the call, the commission has been involved in efforts to improve data on demographics of police encounters and also to establish a community police review board, something that we see emerging in lots of jurisdictions, which is can complement the piece Colette was talking about, which is public integrity units or civil rights units to investigate internally officer-involved shootings. And I think what to me is really exciting about this moment we are in is that there's constantly more comprehensive jurisdiction-wide initiatives emerging to address structural discrimination and anti-Black racism. And this is not something commissions can take on their own, but that's why we wanted to start this conversation, Robin, Jamil, Colette, Dominique, and I today, so we could think about what are the allyships that are needed to move some of these initiatives forward. And so this fourth strategy is emerging jurisdiction-wide efforts. And I'll give a shout out to Los Angeles County, not just because Robin is here, but because Los Angeles County actually has adopted through a recent resolution an an anti-racist, anti-Black racist county strategy, which both recognizing the ongoing impacts of slavery and discrimination, commits to address racism as a public health crisis, and calls for a racial equity lens to be part of looking at internal county policies, but also thinking about change in law and policy. And the second type of jurisdiction-wide initiative goes back exactly to where we started, which is the idea of reparations. And as some of us were talking about this webinar in the planning stages, reparations raise a lot of emotions and feelings in many, many people. And we've seen HR 40 introduced over and over again, the bill that Jamil mentioned, but it seems to really have gained a new momentum. There was just a hearing last week. And there are multiple examples at the local level of reparations initiatives. I'll mention one, which I think is being viewed, it's in the very early stages, but is being viewed as a bit of a success, which comes out of Evanston, Illinois, where the city council committed to end structural racism and achieve racial equity in 2019, and use that as a platform to develop a committee on reparations, form a reparation fund, which is has an actual budget. It's funded out of the new tax revenue from the sale of marijuana in Evanston, and the money will go to a restorative housing reparations fund for Black city residents. And there's other examples in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Asheville, North Carolina as well. And we can share out again some of those resources. The last thing I want to say, because I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A, is also that we realize many on this call are in different positions in terms of their ability to foster local change, but there are large national coalitions that individuals can join, individual agencies can join, and IAOHRA can also support. And HR 40 and reparations was something we talked about earlier, and I just put here the U.S. Conference of Mayors resolution in support of that bill as an example of the kind of solidarity that is possible even where the local changes might require different players and a different set of circumstances. So we have spoken quite a lot. Thank you all for your time and your attention. And I think we are going to open it up now either to responses from other panelists. Well, I can't see what time it is. And or Q&A. So maybe we can see if there's any burning queue questions, and then Colette and Jamil and I can try to answer them.
I think it would be great if perhaps Jamil could tee up a question for Colette, but this is Jean, and I'll give you a piece of something that struck me, Colette, while you were speaking. You were talking about the importance of having public integrity units in prosecutors' offices, states attorneys general, and I'm assuming you're also thinking about local and county and city prosecutors' offices. And I'm wondering if you can distinguish for us between public integrity units and the concept of civilian review boards, because there are challenges in the timing in the investigations, and often the review boards can't get evidence because the prosecutor is, quote, not finished yet. So can you speak to that?
Sure. When we're talking about review boards, I actually put together a blue task force for Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson in creating one for Dallas. And what we found out is that unless you totally remove the review board from having to answer to the police department, it just doesn't work. And so, they have to have their own budget in addition to that. And so most police review boards or oversight boards are tied directly to police departments and to the internal affairs department. And so there is still a branch of control with the oversight groups. And that's why most of them never work, basically the way that we would envision them to work. Whereas a public integrity unit, when you have a public integrity unit, you have something you can measure. You have investigators, you can keep up with the investigation, you can ask them, why is it delaying? Where are you? What resources have you used? How much money have you spent on getting experts? It's a great measuring tool. Without a public integrity unit in place, you're having to talk to a representative from the district attorney's office, who in most cases is twice removed from the case itself. So when you have the public integrity unit, and if it's doing what it's supposed to do, it is working side by side with the oversight board. But even with working with the oversight board, if that oversight board is still a branch with the police department, it is just never going to work.
I'm happy to jump in and ask Colette another question. And I mean, Colette, we're all so interested to hear from your experience and the experience of many other families. One issue that I wanted you to say more about is how the experience of families when there is an investigation, and even sometimes there are no independent investigations, that's part of the problem. But right. When there is an investigation, what is the role of families and how families are participating, right. And in understanding what is going on, and do they have any status? Because some of the things that we are trying to push for is that this is coming really from international model of human rights model, is that victims of human rights violations should have a say. They should have a standing and should have something that they can also protect their own interest in the process. Absolutely. You cannot allow the system and the prosecutors to be doing their thing without allowing the families to be. So if you can say something about your experience or the experience of other families, and to what extent these things can be addressed as through, again, some changes in the laws where local and state human rights commissions could actually be your allies in supporting those kinds of changes.
Absolutely, that's a great question. Before I delve more into it, I'll give you an example of my personal experience, and I've heard hundreds of other families. When we wanted to speak to the grand jury on behalf of Clinton, because we felt like, well, we knew Clinton, they don't really know Clinton. We were told that the grand jury declined to hear from us, which we later found out wasn't true. The district attorney was pitching for the policeman who killed Clinton and did not want us part of that process, did not want us in front of the grand jury. As we sit and waited for their deliberation, the district attorney representative came out of the grand jury hearing, giving each other high five. And it was the most heartbreaking thing to ever experience. But in that moment, we realized that there was something terribly flawed in the grand jury process, and that a lot of people don't talk about, which keeps families from being able to participate. And that process needs to be looked at state by state. We were very successful in Texas in getting the law changed as to how grand jurors are selected. Before we had that law change, a judge could call up his buddy and say, hey, I've got a police shooting here and I need some like-minded people that support policemen to be part of this grand jury when we convene. Believe it or not, there was even a case in Houston where a police officer was killed and his partner served on the grand jury, which should never happen. But those are the egregious things that happen when you don't know all the intricacies of and procedures of investigations. Most of the time, families are left out of the process. And we get hundreds of emails all the time asking, can we help? Can we make a phone call? And we do, and we bridge and we make that connection. But there is a huge, misconnection with police departments. 90%, if your loved one is killed by a policeman, their procedure is not to engage with you. They don't want to talk to you. They want to be able to spin the story the way they want to spin the story. And so most of these families, we have family members that still haven't talked with the police department. So that has to change. We have to get in collaboration with police departments to have them to set up programs starting in training. You have to communicate, and we have begun to do that. It's an arduous feat to do, but no, they're not part of the process. And that's the problem. When you're not part of the process, you don't have a say-so. They take control of the narrative. They assassinate your loved one's character. And so, you know, that has to start happening. But part of the reason why that doesn't happen is because there aren't public integrity units involved. And when you have a public integrity unit, you can work closely with the investigators, the families can. So that's just another layer of having a public integrity unit. But I think the biggest thing that is missing, that is overlooked, are grand juries. We don't know how they work. Remember the Breonna Taylor, the attorney did not want the grand jury tapes to come out. And in that moment, I knew why he did not want to come out, because he went in there and he did nothing for Breonna. He did not represent Breonna Taylor. And that's what, it's like a secret weapon. The district attorneys in most cases, I won't say all, but in most cases, when they talk to grand juries, they're not talking about, you know, the victim and how that person was not armed. They're talking about how by not prosecuting this police officer would salvage his career, and how he or she feared for his life. They're going in and they're pitching for police officers instead of the victims.
I have a question for Jamil. The United States hasn't had a great history of supporting the UN and following through on recommendations. So what do you think the prospect of this new report would do?
Thank you, Ken. This is a really great question. I think this report will have a number of goals, and if Dominique is still on as the chair of the working group, I'll also invite her to weigh in. First, it is really, for the first time, is setting this issue at the agenda of the highest body of the United Nations, the highest human rights body of the United Nations, that is the Human Rights Council. That is not anymore a hidden and a neglected problem. That systemic racism is a clear problem that we need to address globally. And in that problem, there is the police violence that is perpetrated against people of African descent. So that's number one. Number two, it helps then identify clear actions and clear solutions that would be put forward to governments to do what they need to do in order to change. Right now, that is obviously subject to political will. Right now, we have an administration, the Biden administration, that just talked to the Human Rights Council. In fact, yesterday, our new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who said, we are going to re-engage with the Human Rights Council. We want to lead by the power of example. We want to make sure that we are going to lead on issues like equality, etc. And they are doing some initial initiatives, such as the Racial Equity Executive Order, looking at how the federal government ensures that all the operations, all the activities and work of the federal government is centering racial equity in them. So part of that conversation, I think we need to then sound our voices, and we should tell the Biden administration and other governors and other state and local governments that this is the time, responding to Black Lives Matter protests, this is the time to look at the global movement that is calling for change, particularly for racial justice, because Black Lives Matter movement is also a global movement. And in fact, it has already had impacted many countries, from all the way Brazil through Nigeria to Palestine and other parts of the world. And as such, I think if you are really keen to address human rights, you have to start at home. You have to look at concrete measures that you can do that. And one of the ideas that we are bringing to the administration is the fact that you have to incorporate our international human rights obligations into your policies, into your plans. You can't just ignore that and say, oh, we have great civil rights. If you look at, for example, the use of force standards that Colette mentioned in her presentation, there is a huge gap between the United Nations or international standards on the use of force by law enforcement and what the United States allows under the state and local and in fact, under the US Supreme Court jurisprudence. There are things that can be changed and can be changed to the better to make sure that we are not seeing deadly force as a first resort. We are not, for example, we're not seeing accountability happening in the way that it should be. So I think exposing the United States to be part of that global movement that is calling for change, that seeing the transnational solidarity that again was mentioned during the webinar, it is essential component to move policies and right. That is why the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has been most successful movements that happened in the last several decades because it's centered people's, and they also came up with a platform. And the Breathe Act that many Black Lives Matter organizations has proposed, it's a federal bill that was introduced in Congress that really addressed a comprehensive way of looking at systemic racism and racial discrimination, not only in the context of policing, because police is just one aspect of the general problem. So I hope that this report will be added to other opportunities and other avenues where we can pressure the federal government, state government, local governments, and work with them and to offer solutions that are only going to help them do their job better and to protect everyone. The idea is not to leave anyone behind. And that is why the human rights framework is so powerful. It's an inclusive framework. It's a framework that allows for pragmatic solutions, but also structural solutions to take place. While we will not only put out fires, but we're really going to address it seriously. So again, we will see how that will unfold, but our goal is to continue to push for accountability. In fact, you will be hearing from civil society organizations asking for more action, particularly on the US side. And I think we are only asking the other international organizations and countries, in fact, from Africa to other parts of the world, if they're truly for Black Lives Matter and they're truly supporting racial justice, they should push the United States to do the right thing.
I just want to add one comment as a footnote to what Jamil was saying. I mean, if we had talked 10 years ago, and maybe we were talking about this, about the right to housing or the right to health, that would raise eyebrows and question marks. And that is now part of presidential platforms. So I do think it's not because the UN said it, but it is the holistic approach that human rights brings that is a way to articulate what we're hearing in some of the demands that are coming from the organizations and movements that many of us work with.
This is Elisa from IAOHRA, and I have a question that's coming from the Q&A from Nathan. Nathan is asking, how does class and economics fit into this? Most people of color are low income and working class, and the police protect property and intimidate and monitor the working class communities. What would be your response to that?
I mean, I'm happy to say quickly, I think, how does it fit into it? I think it is it. I mean, that is the whole model, and which is why I think the defund, divest, or maybe a nicer way to say it, divert or redirect funding from these institutions that are clearly not serving a purpose that meets all the needs of the community. They might serve a purpose for which they were initially designed, which is a very problematic purpose. And so I think we need to be thinking about economics and class. And obviously we're talking about structural discrimination because that also relates to all of these pieces, and frankly to the opposition to most of these reforms, as is said in, I think, in Charles' comment and question in Robin's as well. Those who are most opposed are those with the most to lose. And that's why we need to be shifting power, really. And that's what a lot of the organizing is about.
Robin has a question that was the same one that Charles Johnson asked about resistance. Did you want to ask that of Colette, Robin?
Sure, thank you, Jean. So yeah, I just thought it would be valuable, since a lot of our members, Colette, come from a diversity of jurisdictions with different political stripes and orientation. So I know that there are a lot that have faced resistance, even in Los Angeles. You know, we know that the union of sheriff's deputies has been a force against a lot of reforms. Just wanted to get your take on what you experienced and what you thought was particularly valuable in dealing with the kind of resistance that I think so many communities face in bringing about reforms in the criminal justice system and in policing.
Absolutely. Data is the most powerful thing that you can have in a community. It doesn't have to be, sexy data. Just starting with data through open records, which is how we started. How many people have been killed in certain zip codes? And we found out that Dallas had what we call hunting grounds. There were certain zip codes where 90% of the killings, 5 zip codes, happened in Dallas. That was huge. So I think when communities want to address the problem of police brutality and with their community leaders, is to arm themselves with some type of data. Because if you don't have data, it's perceived as conjecture, right? So that's what we tell a lot of communities that we go into to help them get set up and to learn who your police chief is, learn who your city council person is, put them to task, start creating email chains and get that data. And once you get that data, you will start to see that things look a little different to police departments. Those are things that they respond to.
Thank you, Colette.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Jim Stowe, and got a question coming in also from Charles Johnson. Does it not seem that those who occupy the highest of offices are the one who resist the most change? Any of the panelists? Colette?
Absolutely. And it's been my experience, and I'm not saying this is with, and I agree with that, by the way, Jim. It's been my experience when I first got into this movement after losing Clinton, the people that I thought, I'm an ex-IBM exec, so I knew how to navigate, and I knew a couple of people, and some of the people that I was privy to were that I knew that could, really help us out. They were like, shying away from it. And so I began to think that, well, what's in it for them, and then what's in it for them to lose? And so usually when that is happening, and again, I want to say that's not all the time, but I have learned when you have a person of a high position and a high rank, and they do not want anything to do with helping families or getting involved, it's because usually they're compromised and they can't afford to be compromised. They can't afford, there's something going on in the background with them, or unsavory, which was the case in Dallas. We had a Black district attorney. We had a Black police chief, a Black fire chief, we had all the Black people involved, and none of those Black people would help us. And we later found out that most of them were compromised. And one is doing federal time now for some backhanded deals that he was doing as a city council person. So, that's usually the case, unfortunately.
I have
One
another
question.
question. This is Elisa again from IAOHRA. And again, thank you, Ms. Faranagan, for sharing your personal story. I had to shut my screen off and collect myself as the mother of a Black son who's 28. It touched me. So thank you for sharing that. It brings it home. And I appreciate that. What can we do? Many of us head up human rights commissions around this country, and we know some of those power players in our communities personally, have relationships with these individuals. What can we do to help move this forward on a personal level, on a local level? How can we help?
The thing with, and that's a great question. And usually people don't know how to move forward with this because they don't know how their local system works. Having privy to a person of power in your city, but if you don't know what the police department is doing and how it's constructed and who's over the internal affairs department, and how many cases has your district attorney turned a blind eye to police shootings? How many police shootings have there been in your city? Arming yourself with that data usually will get those people to move, because they hide behind their titles and conjecture. And if they can deem something as being conjecture, they don't have to move on it, right? So when you go in, so if you know a mayor pro tem personally, and you say, listen, or a city manager, I am concerned. I mean, I have open records here that's saying that, 8 Black men have been shot in one zip code in 2 months. Did you know that? Just putting that data together, and that's what we help communities do. And once you start putting that data together, the movement starts, because once that data is in that person's face, they have to do something. It becomes a measuring tool, right? And then you start to look at things that need to be done and things that are not being done. And so it begins to grow, the advocacy begins to grow. And so again, arming yourself with the data so that when you go to them, you know exactly what you're talking about. And as you talk to them with that data, you'll be surprised that more doors and more information that you didn't even know will open up. And so there become other issues that are on the table, and it begins to grow and grow and grow into your advocacy.
If I may, Lisa, just to add one thing, I think that it's so crucial to center the directly impacted communities in these conversations. And as Colette and other mothers and other families, when they show up, when they talk about their experience, they're talking about their personal experience, but they're also talking as really the most informed experts and advocates. Because they lived through it, they studied it, they had to be dealing with it on a daily basis. So I think it would be helpful when these opportunities arise to try to make sure that they are at the table. They are having access to these people. It could be through very basic things, events, to make sure that these stories are being told and they are able to share what they have learned from their own experiences, and then to communicate that in the most effective way. We had worked at the ACLU, we've worked with formerly incarcerated persons on many campaigns where they would be taking the lead on in making sure that the prosecutors who were running for office are going to be answering tough questions, are going to be mobilizing people to vote and to participate in the process, in hearings, in everything that we do. Those individuals who have suffered those human rights violations, who have lived those experiences, are usually the best informed and the best effective in conveying that message. And I think to the extent that we can create the space for them to be part of that process of change, I think we will be much more successful in getting to a structural change that will save lives, that will save money. I mean, police unions are powerful organizations that immediately jump in and support police officers while families are on their own. Second of all, you've had the secrecy of the whole thing, how it works, right? Well, not only the grand jury system, but the secrecy around, when things are going to be a cover-up that happens oftentimes, especially when you don't have video cameras on, when you have body cameras, we only have the evidence the smoking gun that you'll be able to find to show that. So all of this really requires an engagement with media. I think it's something that so essential, especially now, sticking to the facts and to finding the truth and investigative reporting. I think it works much more effectively on the state and local level, I think, more than national level, because national level, there's so many things, but if you're really zooming on something, I think that's sort of thing that would really make a difference in the way that we can move this conversation forward. I want to try to see if Dominique Day, the chair of the UN Working Group, wants to say any final words. I know that and appreciate that she stayed on the whole conversation. Dominique, are you still
Yeah, she texted that she said, "No, I love listening."
Okay, great. Sorry, I didn't I missed that.
There is another question in the Q&A. I might just go ahead and ask from Nathan. Do your organizations partner with the support local groups fighting for this type of change? I'm a member of a local group in Fort Worth, Texas, that is working on police accountability defunding efforts at the city level. Do you work to help support those efforts?
I will start, and then I think Jamil and Colette can also respond. But one of our ideas in having this conversation was to think about how can we connect Mothers Against Police Brutality and the 400 families that Colette is working and talking about with some of the folks that are at commissions to find what is going to make the change at the local level, right? In some places it might be personal testimony. In some places it might be a letter. In some places it might be the data that families have. So we do our best to work with folks when we have the capacity. Jamil, I'll let him speak about the ACLU and the affiliates, and Colette as well. But certainly connection was the reason we wanted to have this conversation. So that's a great question. Thank you, Nathan.
Colette, you want to go?
Oh, sure. To the question of person in Fort Worth, I would have you to contact us at info@mapbdallas.com because we have created a separate vertical within MAPB about doing the work of defunding the police, because we understand that the narrative was taken away from the movement of defund the police, and so we are trying to take that narrative back and educate people on what that means and what it does and how it means, what it means economically to some people in certain communities, instead of just saying defund the police. So we have a separate vertical for that is growing every day and having more people join it. It's a very important work. So, I would be glad for you to really, if you need some help in your organization, with that, we would be happy to help you or have you come on board with that.
And also from the ACLU, we have all of the work that we do around policing, in fact, is really partnership with local organizations, state and local coalitions, and the effort to support many organizations, particularly Black-led organizations, Black Lives Matter organizations that are pushing for many of those changes, in particularly what we are calling reimagining the role of police in democratic society. Whether you are calling it defund the police or abolish the police or reinvest or divest from the police and shifting resources to communities, I think we are experiencing a real shift in the way that even an organization like the ACLU that have not had a long history of specifically addressing social and economic rights issues, we are now, because of the way that the movement for Black lives and because of the changes that happen in the country, we are now in a position to be addressing systemic inequality And in fact, we just launched a systemic equality campaign that talks about these kinds of issues, not only in the context of policing, which is important, but thinking about other kinds of systemic racism and inequalities and how to address them. Some of those could have to happen at the federal level in legislation, but a lot of that is really state and local policies. So we are happy to connect you with our affiliates in the states where you are. Some affiliates have more chapters within the state and can offer obviously more resources and support for what are you doing. Thank you.
And our friend Paul Booth from Cincinnati, Ohio, asked a question, Colette, about specific models in cities and counties that have worked with respect to reforms within prosecutors' offices.
You know, every state is different. What we personally do is that we do what we call a fact-finding discovery. And working, the first thing they do is to find out, you know, how they work, what's allocated to, as far as investigating for police violence, police shootings, police death. And that has to be sorted out first. And that's part of our model, is doing the fact finding first. And then we move into creating recommendations and then finding out how that city works as far as its local government, city council, who has the power, city manager or the mayor. In Dallas, it's the city manager, not the mayor. So those are the three things that we do. We find out, you know, how the power structure of the city, how the DA's office work, and what is allocated to investigating police crimes.
Great. And Ken, I think we have one more. We have time for one more.
Ryan Snoddy is asking, many folks in government respect the almighty dollar. Has there been an adequate effort at quantifying the economic case for addressing structural racism and police violence? Certainly lives are important, but sadly and truly, the dollars and cents motivate many people in power. Anybody?
I'm sorry, I couldn't, on my end, I couldn't hear it, Ken. I'm sorry. Right. It was muggled.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to, I mean, I am not aware of, I'm sure there are some studies out there talking about the economics of, you know, the police violence and how that is a waste of resources. That's a lot of that happening, obviously. But one thing just to keep in mind, every time taxpayers' money is being spent to pay to defend the police officers and to pay for the compensation, we be better placed if we prevent those killings and prevent those lives from being taken away. And I think there would be so much money saved from some of the compensations. And again, these are limited sums, as Colette said. They're not always. The headlines are usually the ones that are where settlements are being announced, and sometimes the numbers are confidential as part of settlements. But if you think about that police, because of police violence, because of systemic racism, there's so much that is being paid rather than investing this in a holistic way to provide support to those families and communities as a whole, and to prevent those kind of abuses and suffering from happening in the first place. And again, putting it also in the context of historic injustices and having reparations. So the reparations question that is HR 40 is addressing doesn't necessarily take away the importance of specifically addressing current policies that are not right in terms of closing the wealth gap, in terms of for example, the canceling, student debt and how that disproportionately impact people of color, etc. There are two separate things: reparations for historic injustices that happened decades and centuries ago, and then what can be done today in order to make sure that people are able to have some sort of a plain level field, and that is obviously something that requires a lot of work and saves money at the end of the day. When you don't have to spend on remedying violations, you are adding something into people's quality of life and making sure that they are enjoying all their lives. It's the same argument to be made about, when you invest in healthcare systems, rather than in preventive system of healthcare. That saves you a lot of money because people end up not, end up in the system of emergency medical system and overburdening the system, the same thing. So I think that this is a great question to be seeing how localities in every place, whether there is a financial impact assessment to our to these kind of policies, right? And we do a lot of that in environmental impact assessment. Is it time to do racial impact assessment, racial justice impact assessment, and policing assessment of where is the dollars going, and are they going to really benefit everyone, or they are actually depriving people their rights, and they are only making their lives limited in their enjoyment of all their human rights.
And on that point, I wanted to just mention that one approach which LA County took on, because we know budget reflects priorities, is to actually have a measure passed by popular vote that dedicates 10% of our county budget to alternatives to incarceration. And so that's a way to really state clearly, not just make it a statement of words, but to make that a reflection in budget. That's something that's happening right now as we speak, and I think it's a really exciting source of alternatives to the traditional forms of policing and other approaches that have, I think, are all being looked at now for change, and to really think about how that impacts the mass incarceration that has been experienced and the racial disproportionality in arrests and prosecutions that we've seen. I hate to end this because I just feel that it's just going, but I did put out in the chat an invitation for all those who want to continue this conversation to provide us your information, and then we will figure out a time that we can pull folks together to continue the discussion, even at the regional level potentially. We have an Atlantic region, a Southern region, a Western region, and a Midwest region. And that could be another way that we could approach this as well. But really excited to have that ongoing conversation. And I just want to of course, thank the wonderful speakers that we have had today. Thank you so much, Colette. And hearing you and what Mothers Against Police Brutality are doing is just so inspiring. Thank you, Jamil, for always giving a clear connection to what's happening on a global framework and how that connects to our work locally and in this nation. Thank you, Joanne, for really laying out some specific strategies and examples of those and by our member agencies and others around the country and world. I really think that this is such an exciting time. And of course, I don't want to leave out those who also really helped us to facilitate the conversation. That's my fellow IAOHRA board members, my wonderful colleagues, Jean Kelleher, who's immediate past president, Jim Stowe, who is our conference chair and also a past president, and a representative of the Atlantic region. We had Elisa Warren, first vice president, Ken Gunn, our board secretary, but also behind the scenes, we had Gwendolyn Wiggins, Lisa Sims, Kyla Hannigan, but also I want to thank Nick Aramayo, particularly from the ACLU, who really helped us make this happen through his Zoom mastery. So a huge thank you to everyone. I did want to just underline this moment to say, we are really in an extraordinary moment of history, of US history. I have never felt in my lifetime the possibilities that I am seeing now for change. And so I just end with asking all of us to ask ourselves, if not us, who, and if not now, when? So with that, I bring a close to this wonderful event, and IAOHRA extends its heartfelt thanks to all of you who joined us and to our wonderful partners. And we hope to continue this conversation and bring about the kind of change that we know is needed in our world. Thank you.